Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Adherent Apologetics. Really pumped you're joining us today. We talk about philosophy, theology, apologetics, and all kinds of cool stuff. We have Eric Hernandez. We're going to be talking about, can substance dualism be defended? So Eric, what's up? How's it going?
Hey, how you doing? Thanks for having me on.
Good. Are you surviving down in Texas? Because I'm in Virginia right now and it's like crazy hot, and I can't imagine like how bad it would be like down there.
Yeah, it's always hot over here, so I usually stay indoors if I can help it.
Understandable. But today we're going to be talking about can substance dualism be defended? Just like talking about like what is substance dualism and looking at objections from like different views in like the philosophy of mind, like idealism or pansychism. Before we get into that, Eric, just want to talk a little bit about like who you are and what you do.
Yeah, my name's Eric Hernandez. I'm the apologetics lead for the Baptist General Convention of Texas, which encompasses anything from putting together 3 annual, what we call the unapologetic evangelism conferences, and just doing trainings or teachings with churches, pastors, youth leaders, going to college campuses, giving talks or lectures, or even doing debates, or having the privilege of online interactions with fine people like yourself.
You're so kind, and I appreciate you dealing with my bad lighting and my zit across my nose. You know, it's just like second day of classes, and it's like I'm a mess right now. But we had to talk about substance dualism, so I really can't complain. So let's just start off with like, tell us a little bit about like how did you become a substance dualist, and like what kind of drew you into the position of where you're now a substance dualist here.
Yeah, so great question. For those who maybe have heard my backstory, and to try to keep it brief, basically my freshman year of college, I intentionally took a class from an atheist philosophy professor who was known for being antagonistic towards Christianity. And one day, the pivotal moment, really, day in class for me was when he basically brought up an alleged objection, where he basically held up a pill and said, suppose I have an antidepressant pill here. If I take this pill, then it has a power to change the states of what Christians would call something like a soul, and basically starts asking rhetoric questions. Well, how can something physical affect the non-physical, and yada, yada. And then basically says, well, the answer is because there is no soul and there is no afterlife. There's no heaven, no hell. We're just a physical. Now, up until that point in my life, I had heard a lot of complaints against Christianity, but that's all they amounted to. If someone, for example, says, well, I don't like this or that passage in the Old Testament, well, that wouldn't prove Christianity false. But here was, for the first time in my life, I heard an objection that, if true, would mean that Christianity was false. And basically because if Scripture says, Paul says, if there is no resurrection, then our hope's in vain. Well, by the same token, I would argue that if there's no soul, there can be no resurrection, and thus Christianity would be false. So being the kind of person that I was, I couldn't just ignore the objection. So I basically rolled up my sleeves and got my hands dirty with some edit. And that's when I came across the work of my favorite guy today, J.P. Moreland, who has just been such a blessing in my life. Even before I met him, just getting my hands on anything I could of his stuff, and just began learning and studying this stuff. And then admittedly, growing up, I was what you would call a trichotomist, to make a distinction here with substance dualism. So some definitions, perhaps. So substance dualism, it can essentially be described as a view of, when you look at the word dualism, dual means basically twoism. So substance dualism is the idea that there's two things at play here. There is an immaterial substance, which we would call the soul, and then there is a physical body, and there are different variations or flavors of substance dualism. But basically, to try and keep it brief and simple, substance dualism says there's two main things here. There's a body, and then there's an immaterial substance. Now, a trichotomist view, which I would say most your average churchgoer would. So here's where it gets a little not tricky, but if you're not familiar with the language, here's where it can get tricky. Usually when I say I'm a substance dualist, a typical question I get from your average believer is, well, so do you not believe in the spirit? You believe in a soul and a body. Do you not believe in a spirit? Yes, I believe in a spirit, but I would say that the spirit is a faculty or a compartment, if you will, of the soul. So the trichotomist view would say that there are 3 things that are for lack of a better word, separate, perhaps three substances, if you will. Even though I wouldn't say the body's a substance, but just for the sake of conversation, there's three things. There's a body, there's a soul, and there's a spirit. Well, I'm saying there's just a body and a soul, and within the soul, you have these different faculties such as mind, spirit, and things of that nature. So, what kind of shifted me from a trichotomous view, thinking there are three individual things, to a substance dualist view, thinking there are only two types of things, is because essentially, so let's say that the spirit is your faculty. It's a faculty that you communicate with God. So, for example, suppose I were to ask you, what part of your body taste? Is it your tongue? Does your tongue taste, or do you taste? Well, it's a trick question because the right answer would be I taste through my tongue. So I use my tongue's taste buds in order to taste, but I'm the one tasting. I'm just using my tongue to do it. In the same way, if your spirit is that faculty of your soul through which you communicate with God, then you would say I, the soul, am communicating with God by way of the faculty of my spirit. But note that I can do this because the spirit is a part of my soul. Just like I can taste through my tongue because it's part of my body, I can't use your tongue to taste. I have to use mine because, it's already part of me. So it's not something separate, if you will, from my body. In the same way, the spirit is not something separate from my soul. It's a part of my soul. And in that case, there's only one captain of the ship, if you will, and it's my soul, and it drives and utilizes everything else that's a part of me, be it my body, my spirit, my mind, and whatnot. So for that reason, I would say I'm a substance dualist. My soul is me, the self, and that soul has a bunch of faculties and compartments to it. And one of those faculties would be the spirit. So the spirit is not something separate from the soul. If it were, then when my spirit prays, is it me, my soul, or my spirit? Well, no, I'm praying. Well, but if it's my spirit that prays, then it can't be me if I'm a soul. So in other words, I'm either having to jump from one thing to two, but then you have like more than three and it gets even more complicated. So it's best to just say I am a soul, and within my soul, there's different compartments or faculties, if you will, and one of those is my spirit.
Yeah, it's super fun. So my next question for you then is like, in your view, Eric, like, why do you think substance dualism is like the superior view? Like, it looks like, let's say that like maybe like you can be like a Christian or atheist, and you're gonna say, yeah, like consciousness or whatever that is, like it's not just something that's just a product of my brain. Now we got all these different views on the table. Like we're gonna talk about like idealism or pansychism later, and there's like the Christian physicalists. Like, it's like what makes substance dualism superior to the other things on the market, in your opinion, Eric?
Yeah, so good question. Well, a few things. So first, what is a soul? I would define the soul is an immaterial substance that is the possessor of consciousness. And it's a thing that enlivens a body, it animates the body, and at development, it's what forms the body. So when I say, when I use the word soul, we can say that this is synonymous, or it is synonymous with the self. So the word I is an indexical word that refers to something. When I use the word I'm referring to me, the soul. So given that there's two things at play, the word I refers to the soul, not the body. And the reason basically I would hold to substance dualism over anything else, well, depends on what aspect you want to touch on it.
Mm-hmm.
But one thing we can say is, when Occam's razor would say that you don't want to multiply hypotheses needed, and I would say substance dualism provides the best explanation for it. Now, as you said, we'll get to later, an idealist could probably say the same thing, and that's a different, like, we can touch that when we get there. But basically, substance dualism, I would say, explains a lot of things. Anything from from a Christian perspective, the possibility of disembodiment. There's this, when you look at the Jewish belief, especially when you looked at what the Pharisees believed, there was this, I believe it's John Green, who he wrote a book, and I forget the name of it, but basically looks at the Old and New Testament and goes through biblical passages and what they would have believed about the afterlife. And he has what he calls a two-part eschatology, where there was this intermediate state where once I die, I continue to exist, but I'm disembodied. It's what Paul refers to when he talks about this earthly tent being destroyed, and then putting on a heavenly body, later glorified heavenly tent. So there's this intermediate state that is prior to the final resurrection, which means I don't cease to exist. I continue to exist. And then at the final resurrection, then that's the second step of the eschatological process, if you will, where now I have a glorified body. So I think from a Christian perspective, it explains those quite well. When we also see that there's this correlation between the mind and brain, and this goes into things like one of the oddest objections that I think that people have towards the soul, because, and tell me when to stop here, wherever you want me to either slow down or unpack more, whatever. Some people will say, well, we know that in cases of things like Alzheimer's, if I have certain brain damage to certain regions of my brain that are correlated with memory, then it affects, the way I think or the way I can recall thoughts or memories and things like that. And somehow they think this is some kind of an epiphany that would show that there is no soul. It's all something in the brain. But what strikes me as odd is, first of all, the people who usually bring this up as an objection say it as if no one's ever thought about this in the history of philosophy of mind. As if, like, wait a minute, you're telling me that if you hit me over the head really hard, I might forget some things. Like, no way. Like write a paper about this, please. Like, this is unheard of. But of course, even in Aristotle's day, they knew, well, no, you hit someone over the head. Cavemen would have known this. It something in the head region affects your conscious states. But this wouldn't prove that there's no soul. It just proves that there's a correlation, much like detuning a guitar or popping a guitar string shows that there's a correlation between that and the music I'm trying to play. But it wouldn't follow from this that therefore my music is inside of the guitar or is nothing more than a guitar. Obviously, there's just a correlation and a cause and effect dependency relationship between the two. When we look at other things such as the features and nature of consciousness is where it gets really exciting for me, where it goes to show there has to be something more than the physical at play. So there are certain features of consciousness that are simply not true of anything physical. In other words, you could describe everything that exists that is physical. You can describe it 100%, everything about it, without ever appealing to any type of conscious properties. I could describe, shapes and sizes, but I won't ever have to appeal to consciousness. So there are certain things true of consciousness that are not true of physical states. For example, my belief that grass is green is a conscious state. It's a belief, which is a state of consciousness, but nothing physical is about or of grass being green. That's a mental state. Conscious subjects possess those kind of properties. Physical things don't possess those kind of properties. You look at what's called Leibniz's law of identity, which basically says if two things in question are the same, then whatever is true of one is going to have to be true of the other and vice versa.
Eric, I can't hear you.
There?
Anyone watching? Oh. You're back. We lost you there for a minute. I think you're back now. So
okay, yes. Sorry, where did I leave off of?
You're just looking at the law of identity, and then I lost you there for a moment.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Sorry, my soul was briefly stepped out. So, law of identity. Leibniz's law of identity. Basically, if two things are the same, then whatever is true of one is true of the other. So if I said Eric Hernandez is the same person as a guest on your show, then I'm just using two different referent titles to refer to the same person. So because of that, whatever is true of Eric Hernandez is going to be true of your guest because, again, they're the same person. But if I can find one thing true of your guest that's not true of Eric Hernandez and vice versa, then they're not the same thing. The typical example I use is suppose you walk into a lab and you see two bottles of clear fluid, and one says water, but let's say another one has a label ripped off, and you don't know what it is, but let's say that was chemical X. Well, applying Leibniz's law of identity, you look at the properties they have, and you notice that they both have the property of being a clear fluid. So you think, well, so far they must be the same substance. But then you turn over the bottle that has a label ripped off, and on the back, there's another label that says caution flammable. And you think, okay, so I know that water's not flammable. Therefore, even if I don't know what chemical X is, at the very least, I know that they can't be the same substance because I now have something true of one that's not true of the other. Now, with that in mind, if there is no soul, then consciousness, if it exists, is going to have to be either reducible and or identical to something physical like the brain. But we know that's simply not true, and it's easy to show that. Um, Take a state of my mind like my thought or my belief. My thoughts and beliefs can be true or false, but it makes no sense to say that a region or group of neurons firing in my brain is true or false. My belief or my thought that I'm talking to you right now, let contrast that with, say, the state of my brain, which can weigh 3 pounds. My brain can weigh 3 pounds, but my thoughts and my belief that I'm talking to you right now doesn't weigh 3 pounds. My brain can be 7 inches long, but the smell of a rose or the taste of a banana, which is a mental state, it's a sensation. Those aren't my. The taste of banana is not 7 inches long. It doesn't even make sense to ask the question. So there are things true of my mind that are not true of my brain, and vice versa. And all the properties of my brain are physical things, and all the properties of my mind are non-physical things. And given Leibniz's law of identity, and we would just need one example of this, it would show that the mind and brain are not the same thing. And I would argue that consciousness is not physical. So basically what you now have here is consciousness existing, but not possessing any physical properties, but it still needs to be grounded in something. As Dr. Moreland says, thoughts have thinkers. Thoughts don't just float around in the air. When I say, the thought that grass is green, someone possesses that thought. That's me. Well, what am I? Well, the word I, as I said earlier, refers to me, the soul. So when I say that I have a thought, I'm literally saying it's my soul that is possessing these conscious states, beliefs, and properties. So my thoughts and beliefs are in my mind, which is a faculty of my soul, not a faculty of my brain. Again, going back to the guitar, there's a correlation, but correlation and dependency doesn't establish identity, that they're the same thing. It just shows, a correlation. So for those reasons and more, again, you would need some immaterial substance that is possessing these properties, namely the soul. You have conscious states being different than physical states, so they're not the same thing as a brain. And then you have the biblical aspect in verses, which we didn't get into, but suffice to say that there's lots of biblical passages which refer to the immaterial states of a person, talk about disembodiment, even Paul, where he says, there's a guy, whether he was in the body or out of the body, I don't know, which at least goes to show he believed that there was a disembodied state and believed this could happen. You have Samuel being conjured up by the witch of Endor, where you have this, talking to the dead, which again would go to show a disembodied state. Lots more passages I can go to, but suffice to say, I think substance dualism is the best explanation for all the things I've said and more.
Yeah, that's super great. And I think we'll get, because there's a question there that we'll get to in a little bit about like biblical support for substance dualism. But like one of the main worries with substance dualism is the interaction problem. So it's the idea of we have like, there's like this immaterial like consciousness that we call like our soul, and we have like this physical brain. And they seem to be not dependent, but they seem to be interacting somehow with each other. Like our brain states in some sense relate to our mental states and vice versa. But then it's like, how? Like it just seems like given substance dualism, maybe we'd be able to like detect this difference with maybe like the law of conservation of energy or something. So like, how would you respond to this interaction problem, Eric, of like, how does this like immaterial mind soul interact with the brain?
Yeah. So you did say that it's a concern. Usually if someone were to say what's a concern, I would say, well, what's concerning about it? What's the big deal about it?
Yeah.
Suffice to say, and I know that's not how you meant it, but people usually present it as if it's somehow an objection. A few things to say here. The first thing I'm going to say is just my own thought here doesn't have necessarily any weight one way or the other, but I don't sleep about the interaction problem, because there is no problem. If anything, it's a challenge. It's something to think about. But I'll put it this way. If one way to show that it's not an objection, especially when people pose it as an objection, one of the first answers I give is, well, suppose I said, I don't know. What follows? Nothing. Nothing stands or falls on whether or not I can answer the interaction problem. And for those listening, like you said, how does the soul interact with the body? The arguments that I would give for the soul, for the existence of the soul, are ontological arguments, whereas a question of how the soul interacts with the body is more of an epistemic question. So the epistemic question doesn't, again, do anything to invalidate the ontological arguments I would give for the existence of the soul. In other words, whether or not I can answer the question does nothing, against the arguments in favor of the existence of the soul. It's kind of like saying, okay, well, if you can drive your car, by putting it in the ignition and turning it on and driving it, but that proves that your car works. But how does it work? How does a car function? Well, I could say I don't know, but it doesn't mean therefore I can't drive a car, or therefore my car doesn't exist, or anything like that. I would say the same thing with the soul and body. Now that being said, which again, it bears no weight. It's an epistemic question that does nothing to affect or defeat, much less prove wrong the ontological arguments. And then nothing stands or falls, like I said, on it. Now, nevertheless, some other things now can be said. Now, if I were to try and answer the how, well, there's been lots of answers put forward, but the first thing I'd say is it's a basic action, or what you would call a primitive action. It's a direct A to B kind of cause. Because if someone's asking how does a soul interact with the body, if by that they're asking for some type of intermediate mechanism, how does A interact with B? Well, suppose I were to postulate some entity C. A interacts with B through entity C. Well, then that just kind of raises another question. Okay, well then how does A interact with C in order to interact with B? Well, then I can say, well, let's say by some D. So A interacts with D to interact with C to interact with, and you see the problem. We can keep doing this till the cows come home, and it would lead to an infinite regress. So, throwing in Occam's razor once again, and just going just even further, it's just traditionally, it's just been thought of as a direct A to B interaction. What's called in philosophy a primitive action or a basic action. The soul just directly interacts with the body. There's no intervening mechanism. Now, I don't think, at least for our purposes here, and again, I don't lose sleep. For me, that's sufficient to say, yeah, it's a direct type of interaction. To give an analogy that may or may not be the best one to give, you can think of magnets, a magnetic force interacting with metal. There's no intervening mechanism by which a magnetic force attracts metal or moves a metal. It just does it directly. Even if I can't explain it any further, it doesn't prove or disprove whether or not, magnets, can pull metal. And you have something physical and some magnetic field, which I would argue is not physical, though it may be, again, correlated with something physical, is not itself something physical. You have this interaction taking place. I've also heard Moreland say, again, there's a lot of great answers out there. I don't put my finger on one of them in particular, but if anything, just share them. Another one would be that the mind, or the soul and body, it's not a closed system. So it wouldn't break any laws of physics to say that the soul somehow would even create energy to make something happen in the body if it's an open system. Aside from that, I would also say, I've heard Moreland use the example or the illustration, the amount of energy that takes place, say at the Hoover Dam. Let's say there's just one switch. I go to the Hoover Dam and I flip the switch. And when I flip the switch, a massive amount of energy is released from the water that's in the Hoover Dam. Now, compare the amount of energy it took to flip the switch. Compare that to the amount of energy that was released after I flipped the switch. It's just a huge difference. And to try and find the energy to flip the switch in all of that energy of what's released in the Hoover Dam, it would almost be insignificant or lost within, trying to look where that came from. So if the soul did create some energy, it would be comparable to that, where you probably couldn't even detect it, or it would be just so insignificant. I've heard even someone now say that the soul could just kind of direct the energy that's already there in the brain, the electricity. I haven't looked too deep into it because, again, I don't necessarily lose sleep over it. I think there are many sufficient answers out there. Someone once sent me a paper written by this guy who is who is a philosopher and a physicist and knows his stuff. I got about 2 pages into this long article, and I thought, sure, sounds good. Sounds good to me. But yeah, that's in a nutshell. I would answer it that way. So just to recap, One, I don't think it is a problem. Two, even if I said I don't know, nothing stands or falls. Three, it's a direct A to B interaction. There's no intermediate intervening mechanism. Four, it could be that even if energy is created, it's insignificant compared to what happens in the body, kind of like flipping the switch on Hoover Dam. And then maybe 4 and 5, some people have come up with really smart formulations that, way over my head that respond to those. And I've heard someone now say, well, the soul can just kind of direct the energy that's already there. It doesn't have to create anything new.
That's super great, Eric. I appreciate that. So what we'll do now, because I think it's kind of related, is like talk about panpsychism. So it's this idea of, let's say, like, well, yeah, there is this hard problem of consciousness, and like consciousness isn't just reducible to like material brain states. So let's say the consciousness in some sense is like fundamental. So like I'm not a panpsychist, I don't really understand it that well, but like somehow like underlying like matter is also this consciousness. Like it's a feature of matter to also be conscious. When we get enough matter together in like a sophisticated thing like the brain, then we got consciousness. So like my friend Emerson Green talks about it, like it's just like physicalism, but granting like the hard problem or something like that. So I wonder then, like in your mind, like what makes substance dualism better than to say like panpsychism? Because you say like maybe the panpsychist might get around the interaction problems. So maybe they have like a win here over like a substance dualist in terms of like a simplicity or maybe like explanatory power. So in short, just like Eric, why would you prefer substance dualism over panpsychism?
Yeah, good. So a few things to be said here. So what is panpsychism? Kind of like, basically what you explained it. The best explanation I've seen is in a meme where this guy just, those little eyes you can get from craft stores. He basically got those little shaky eyes and just glued them onto glued them onto stuff, and just like glued them onto anything you can think of. Like a remote, and said, panpsychism, and just put little eyes on like toasters and stuff like that. So it's basically the idea that so for one, I think panpsychism is ad hoc. I know one of the a more popular level proponent of this has been Thomas Nagel, and basically Nagel sees the problem and basically says, look guys, and he, by the way, for those who don't know, Thomas Nagel is an atheist, a naturalist, and he basically says, we know consciousness exists. We know that you can't get consciousness by simply rearranging physical stuff together, like by Lego bricks. And that's my illustration, not his. You don't get like Lego bricks together, get a really complicated Lego collection, put it in a really complicated structure, and all of a sudden you have consciousness. Because consciousness isn't the kind of thing that just pops up like that, that which kind of deals with the the question of supervenience or emergent properties. He says you can't get consciousness by just emerging like that. So basically Nagel says, so what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to say consciousness has always been there from the beginning, because the thing with emergent properties is basically I can't rearrange a red brick house. I can't rearrange a red brick house, add or take away bricks and put a certain structure, and from that get the color blue, because the color blue is not something I get from rearranging red bricks. It's a different type of property. Consciousness would be the same thing. So in other words, blue would have to already be there. Nagel says, and again, that was my illustration, not his, but Nagel says, same thing with consciousness. It's going to have to be there from the beginning. So he says everything that exists, anything you can grab, it already has conscious properties in it, latent within it. You just have to get the right arrangement and structure. Now, what makes us different is that you're not getting consciousness from something that didn't have consciousness there to begin with. On panpsychism, consciousness is already there. It just has to be unlocked, if you will. And that unlocking takes place. And again, that's my word, not his. That unlocking takes place by just rearranging the physical structure of these things that already have consciousness latent potentially within it. Now, I think that's ad hoc. I can applaud him for at least trying to be consistent in because he's basically admitting that consciousness has to be there from the beginning. Now, because he's an atheist, he says, well, it's just a brute fact, which again, I would say is ad hoc. Whereas a Christian would say, well, no, consciousness is fundamental and has always been there from the beginning. And his name is God. And he is the foundation, sustainer of all things, creator of all things. So on the Christian view and the panpsychist view, consciousness is there from the beginning. It's just that on the Christian view, you have God, who is the thing that gives everything else consciousness is the necessary, metaphysically, logically necessary being that exists, has always existed. Whereas Thomas Nagel says, well, it's just got to be there because how else can you explain it? And let's not go to God because he's said himself, I don't want God to exist. So I think it becomes ad hoc, and substance dualism becomes a much better explanation there.
Yeah, I think I have a lot of sympathies with you, like especially like with like an atheistic version of panpsychism, because then it seems like they're going to be proposing like, well, yeah, there's this fundamental like matter or something, but there's also like this fundamental consciousness, and there's like these two things, and then like the theist can be like, hey, we just say let's just explain everything with consciousness, not even you don't even have to be an idealist to say that, like God's a perfect mind, and that's how we get our story. Like it just seems simpler. And then maybe like theistic, like panpsychism, like I think her name is Joanna Leidenhag a few months ago on the show, talking like she's a panpsychist, but she's like God gave the matter consciousness in a sense. So it's not there from in the beginning. It's just like the way God created it, which is like, okay, maybe, but it still just seems like, I don't know. Panpsychism just seems very like counterintuitive to me. Do you have anything you want to add, Eric, or we can move on?
So I haven't. So the person you mentioned, I haven't looked them up or heard of them. It's the first time I've heard of a Christian panpsychist. I could imagine there could be a theistic panpsychist. I think it's again ad hoc. Now I would say that. So when I was first studying this, I did had the privilege. I think it was the first time I ever talked to Mortland over the phone. I did ask him how, because I would hold to a Traducian view of the soul without getting, bringing up another can of worms. But basically, and I pretty much asked him, how is this different than panpsychism, or, how is it not the same thing? Well, first of all, so on my view of the soul, it's biological tissue that has conscious properties, or what he calls conscious totipotentiality. And again, without going into those kind of worms, whereas panpsychism says everything, not just biological matter or tissue, but everything, including this marker, has conscious potential. At that point, to me, there's a big disconnect. So, for example, if you were to get a starfish arm and sever it, that starfish arm has a potential to become another starfish. But it's easier to see how a starfish arm can become another starfish than to see how this marker can become a conscious living thing. In my mind, it's just intuitive. There's a huge difference between the two. So whereas I would say, yes, everything that is biological, especially let's just stick with human tissue, biological matter. This is how when a woman gets pregnant, you can have this twinning effect where you have the fertilized egg, the baby, the person split, and you have twins. Again, that's different than saying this marker can become twins or can become a conscious subject. So yeah, I would just reiterate, even if you add that theistic twist, it is still, I would argue, is ad hoc.
I like how you describe it like panpsychism with a theistic twist. I really like that, Eric. So that's good. So let's talk about idealism now.
Good things.
You're from Texas, you gotta have cool things. So let's talk about like idealism, and this is the idea that like everything is like conscious or like the product of consciousness. So like like it'd be like, well, maybe like we're living in like inside God's mind, like we're mind inside God's mind or something like that. And you talked about like Occam's razor like a while in the beginning of this interview, and like I think the idealist would be like, yeah, like let's get rid of this like mind independent matter that you're talking about. Like, come on, Eric, that's so like 20th century of you. Come on, get into the new age where we can get rid of this. So it seems like so what's your kind of gripe against like idealism and why you prefer substance dualism?
Yeah, so I have much more sympathy. I'd sympathize much more with the idealist than I would with the panpsychist. So, in a nutshell, again, for those listening, idealism would be that everything is dependent on mind, or everything is a product of the mind. Now, depending on what type of idealist you're talking about, I could agree or disagree. Now, Ben Arbour, the late Ben Arbour, who passed away not too relatively long ago, I once had a phone conversation with him, and I asked him about panpsychism and what he thought, and he says, "Well, technically, Eric, every Christian is a panpsychist." And when he said that, it just kind of clicked in my head. I mean, excuse me, heresy. No, rewind, edit that out. He said every Christian is an idealist to some extent, and that's when it kind of clicked in my mind. Like, yeah, that's true. Because if idealism is a view that everything is dependent or a product of the mind, well, then obviously God is an unembodied mind, and everything that exists owes its existence to Him in one way or another. So yes, everything is a product and dependent on a mind, namely God's mind. So in that sense, if you want to say everything is a product dependent on and sustained by a mind, namely God's mind, then sure, you can call me an idealist all day. I'm fine with that. But then there's a stronger form, if you will, of idealism that denies the existence of anything physical or material altogether and says, no, everything is just mental and there is no physical existence. Now, I would say you definitely would want an idealist to argue these positions for himself. Don't take it from me, in other words. But I can say one illustration I can think of is, so when I'm having a dream, if I were to have a dream, the people that exist within my dream, they're not physical things. In my dream, I can interact with them. In my dream, I can hug them. But technically speaking, I'm not hugging anything physical. There's nothing physical there. Although in my mind, it's as if these things are physical and exist. Now, the strong idealist, if you will, is going to say that that's kind of how reality is. Either we're in the mind of God, or we're in the mind of some God, or everything is just a type of, and this is an oversimplification, but like a matrix stimulation where this marker isn't really there in a physical sense. It doesn't exist physically. It's just a mental, again, depending on what kind of idealist you talk to, it's a projection, it's an illusion, however you want to call it. Now, yeah, I think Occam's razor can kind of cut both ways here and say, well, we don't need to posit anything physical if we can just say everything's mental. But Occam's razor is more than just, how many things can we lessen? It's also, it's a tiebreaker. And I think there's not necessarily a tie here. And of course, they may say the same thing, but just as we would intuit and conceive of moral properties and attributes and moral things about the world, I think we are justified in the same way of intuiting the existence of physical things in the world. I think this, I can feel this, it's physical, and I don't have any reason to not believe that it exists as something physical, other than the idealist coming to me and telling me that it's not really there, or the strong idealist. So yeah, I don't see why God would create a world of something that feels physical, looks physical, smells, tastes, everything physical, and yet it not be there and be physical. I just don't see an argument for that, other than to say, and again, let an idealist argue for himself, but other than to say, well, we don't need to postulate that. Let's just say everything's mental. Now, well, where I will sympathize with the idealist is you cannot, everything at some point is going to have to point back to consciousness, which I think is quite fascinating. Because earlier I said, you can describe everything in the physical without alluding to consciousness. But then there's, in one sense, the moment you begin to try and describe physical things as someone else, then you have to appeal to conscious states. For example, if I said this is hard, what does it mean to be hard? Well, you can talk about density and you can talk about these things, but how do we know what hardness or density is? Well, you have to experience it. Well, hardness is an experience. It's a sensation, which is a mental state. So in order to describe something or anything at all to someone else, I have to appeal to consciousness. So what's interesting is that you can't even, get away from consciousness, even when you're describing things that aren't conscious to someone else. So if I say something's blue, well, I can't, that wouldn't make sense to someone who's colorblind or who was born blind or have never seen the color blue. Everything is going to point back to consciousness. Now, in that sense, again, I can be sympathetic with the idealist, but again, I would say, but I think these things are actual features of reality that are there, independent of our minds. Now, are they independent of God's mind? Well, no, but that's because nothing's independent of God's mind. Everything is dependent on God, who is an unembodied mind. But yeah, I think these things are really there. God created them physically, and I think they're and just shooting from the hip here. When you think about the intermediate state, you hear about NDEs and, people being disembodied and yet coming back, being resuscitated or whatever. I think that type of state would be more of an idealist state in the sense that we're talking about here. I think that when you exist disembodied prior to the final resurrection in this intermediate state, I do think in that sense, I think, yes, it is some type. And again, I know I keep opening just cans of worms here. So, just I'll try to stop opening these. But yes, I think in that sense, it is a type of idealist picture reality of existence where I am existing without a body, but yet am still able to interact with other disembodied souls in some way that appears as if it's something physical. And again, without going too deep or, dipping my toe into heresy somehow an accident, I would say, at best, I'd say, yeah, that I could say is some type of an idealist state.
Yeah. No, it's a lot of fun to think about. And like, I'm just going back to your color thing. Like, even before I was really interested in like thinking about like the mind and stuff, I always thought about like, what's like, well, I see red there, but like, how could I, like, what if like Eric's over there and he sees like what I perceive as blue and that's what just really calls red? Like there's just no way you could like tell these things apart. Like, cause like there is this like this state of this conscious state that's only true to you. And I just thought of that as you were talking. I was like, yeah, this is just kind of, it seems pretty at least intuitively true to me.
Yeah. So that's really interesting that you bring that up. So that's something like inverted qualia. So that's another feature of consciousness that I would say is not physical. Is that consciousness is a first person private access kind of a thing, meaning only I have access to my conscious states. You don't. Now, note that's different than saying only I have access to my brain states. In other words, if someone wanted to look at my brain, well, gassy here. Excuse me. I don't know what it was, what I ate earlier. But any third-party observer can have access to my brain and my brain states, but no one else has access to my mind other than me, a first-person observer versus a third-party observer. I like what Moreland says. A neuroscientist can know more about my brain than I do, but can never know more about my mental life than I do. So when you go to the doctor and you go to, let's say, an eye doctor, and he wants to know what kind of glasses to give you, he asks you to look at these numbers or letters on a wall. But no, he has to do more than just look at your eyes. He has to ask you what you see. Because although he can look at your eyes, he can't look at your mental states and what you see. So when you're looking at the number 3 at a distance and you close one eye and he says, what do you see? And you say, well, I see the number 8 or I see the letter B. He doesn't laugh at you and say, wow, what an idiot. No, it's 3. It's not in the number 8. It's not the letter B. No, he doesn't say you're lying. He believes you and then just writes down, oh, his eyes are bad from this distance. In other words, he can't just look at your eyes to know what you're seeing. He has to ask you what you're seeing because your mental states are a product of your mind, not your brain or eyes. Now, also, again, to what you're referring to, yeah, inverted qualia. So I have a friend, I haven't talked to him in a while because, since I moved, but at a job I used to work at, I used to work at a school, and there were these motivational posters, all over the school, as you would imagine for any school. And I think it was like a poster of Skittles or something like that. And it had words like hope and I don't know, what are other nice words to get the kids motivated these days? Hope and dream,
and, shoot for the stars.
Just things, those words like that. But it was Skittles, and then certain colors of the Skittles were rearranged. So like all the red Skittles said hope, right? And then like the yellow Skittles said, I don't know, dream or whatever. And I hadn't noticed that until I got close and looked at it, and I said, "Oh, it says hope and dream or whatever." And my friend says, "Where?" And I said, "Right there." And he says, "I don't see it." I said, "Right there, the red ones." He goes, "These red ones?" And he pointed to the yellow ones. I said, "No, that's yellow." He goes, "Oh, these red ones?" I'm like, "No, that's green." I'm like, "Dude, are you colorblind?" He's like, "Yeah." I was like, "Oh, yeah." Snap. I was like, "Oh, snap. I didn't know that." And he was trying to hide it at first. I don't know if he was embarrassed. But long story short, there's different types of color blindedness. In fact, you can actually look it up. If you want to, you can look it up. I'm kind of now curious. You can hear me typing.
You're good.
But so I had to look this up myself because it was just so fascinating to me that, okay, here it is. I don't know how to share. If you want me to share, or if you want me to send it to you.
You can share a screen. I do want to say we're wasting our time because Trinity Radio just proved God exists by saying if God does not exist, Eric Hernandez does not exist, but Eric Hernandez does exist, therefore God exists. So we're really just wasting our time.
Wow.
Like Braxton or Pritchett, whoever's chatting, they solved it. So we're wasting our time. But you can share your screen and
I'm leaving now. I mean, this is good. This is good stuff. No, and hey, Trinity Radio, that is, I love both those guys. Whoever it is, awesome guys. Okay, don't show these tips again. Sure.
I do want to say, like, as you're trying to pull this up, like, one of my best friends is colorblind, to some degree. Not like describing colors to him, it's like you just can't do it, and it's like it's just so hard to describe these things.
Can you see? Whoa.
Oh,
okay, can you see this one here? Can you see
yeah,
that?
yeah.
So I think his was, I think, this one right here. So see how there's like 3 different types of color blindness, but notice how like the reds and greens just look yellow, and for him that's pretty much what it was. So it's going to do that thing again. Stop sharing. I guess Craig's wrong. You can't have an infinite set of things. But yeah. So basically, that was when it first occurred to me that like his world is like almost like a Dr. Seuss kind of a world, because he said everything that's red or green just looks like a different shade of yellow to him. So I was like, so what color is your blood? You know, what color are the stripes on the American flag? What color is grass to you? How do you, and I even asked him, so when you approach a stoplight, how do you know when to go? And he says he either looks at the order, because now he knows what color is what, or he waits and looks at what the other cars do. So, yeah, we both see the same thing that is, again, independent of me or his perspective. There is a color there that actually exists, but he sees something different than I do because of something in the brain and something in the eyes, that are not functioning like they should be functioning. So yeah, I think inverted quality is definitely one of those things that would go to prove the immaterial nature of consciousness, substance dualism. And I would say, could even be an argument against idealism, but I'm sure they might say the same in their case. So, yeah.
No, you definitely just debunked it, idealism, Eric. So one last kind of like direction I'd like to take this is just thinking about like there's the question of like, do babies have souls? Do animals have souls? This is just something interesting to think about, because like I think about like as Christians, we want to say like life begins at like conception. So we want to say that like probably something like like an embryo has a soul. But we have this problem of like, well, how many people remember like what it was like to be conscious like when they're an embryo, and like no one's gonna raise their hands if they're honest. And like the same thing can be applied to like, what about? Oh, okay, never mind, Eric. So
no, I'm joking.
But Braxton already proved God exists. So it doesn't matter. But like, so we have this worry of like, okay, well, no one does. So like, no one's really conscious at an embryo, and like very few people like 1 year old or like 2 years old. It seems like our consciousness almost seems to like develop as our brain develops. And like we already talked about, like like if I hit you in the head, doesn't that debunk substance dualism? And we went through that objection. But like it seems like there are these like very close ties between like brain states and like our levels of consciousness. So I guess my question for you is like, how do you approach that as like a substance dualist? Because I'm guessing you'd want to say some sort of story like where God gives a person a soul at like conception, but then they're not conscious until they're like, or like really like understanding things till like 2-3 years old. So like, what's going on here, Eric?
Yeah. So the question about, so we're asking about baby souls, so to speak. Yes. Is that right? Or when the soul? So, so yeah, usually the way this question is asked to me is, when does a soul enter the body? Which you didn't ask it that way, but let me just, tackle it this way. And for me, that's not the right question to ask on my view. So there's 2 different views of the soul. There's what's called the creationist view, not to be confused with creationism as in Age of the Earth kind of stuff, but there's a creation view of the soul and the traducing view of the soul. To oversimplify both, the creationist view of the soul, God looks at a fertilized egg and says, looks good enough to me. It looks like the right parts are there. Hey, Gabriel or, Michael, whatever, some angel, hey, zap that bad boy with the soul. So God, quote, puts a soul in a body. On the traducian view, it's just that God has set up the world in such a way that when 2 things that possess soulish potentiality come together, there is what you would call a substantial change, and a new soul as a substance comes into existence. So this is different, and this is where I asked Moreland about, well, how does this differ from something else like panpsychism? It's because the body would be, the example he gives is like sugar and water. When you pour sugar in water and you stir it, the sugar is now infused all throughout the water. So in the same way, my soul is infused, if you will, all throughout my biological matter, all throughout my body. So when I wiggle my finger and then I wiggle my toe, which you can't see me doing, but I'm doing, it's not as if my soul has to travel from the tip of my finger and then race down to my toe in order for me to move it. It's that my soul is omnipresent to my body, if you will. So that being said, when you have a sperm and egg meet, a substantial change occurs and a new substance comes into existence. Now, substantial change is different than a mere rearrangement of parts. So, for example, to go a little bit deep here, when hydrogen and oxygen come together to form water, in a metaphysical sense, the hydrogen and oxygen cease to exist, and now a new substance emerges, namely water. And this is why you have water possessing new properties, because you now have a new substance. So water possesses the properties of wetness, whereas hydrogen and oxygen do not possess the properties of wetness, because those things have ceased to exist and a new substance has emerged. You have a substantial change. In the same way, I would say it is with the soul. Now, that being said, so yes, the soul would be there from conception. When the sperm and egg meet, you have a new substantial change, namely a new soul comes into existence. Now, that does not mean, however, that the embryo, this new person, is conscious. So let me explain that aspect. Part of what makes someone a person is that this soul possesses what we would call ultimate capacities. Now, there's a difference between an ultimate capacity and a first order capacity. So I have the first order capacity to speak English, which means not only do I have the potential to speak English, I can actually do it. And I've been doing it for the past, 45, 50 minutes. But I also have the ultimate capacity to speak French. Now, I don't know how to speak French other than like bonjour or oui, oui, only because I've seen those in movies. But I don't know how to speak French. So I have the ultimate capacity to do so, but I don't have the actual capacity to do so. Now, in the same way, in the same sense, a human soul has these ultimate capacities, but it doesn't mean that just because it has these ultimate capacities, therefore all these capacities are available as a first order capacity that I can on command do as I wish. So think about it this way. If I were to go into a coma, I'd still be a person, even though I'm not conscious, because I would still have the ultimate capacity to be conscious. I just need whatever's inhibiting my consciousness to take place. So in other words, there's something blocking that capacity from coming into fruition. I would say in the same way, when you have a new person come into existence by way of a fertilized egg, you now have a person, but it doesn't necessarily mean that this person is conscious. It may still be the case that it needs to develop the certain physical attributes and properties in order for the utilization of this ultimate capacity of consciousness to take place. So you have a person, but it doesn't necessarily mean therefore it's conscious. Just like when I'm asleep or in a coma, I'm a person and yet not conscious. So yeah, asking about, whether or not, we would remember what we were thinking in there assumes that we would have the actualized capacity of consciousness as a first order while we're embryos. I just don't think we do. That might not come till, I don't know when later, but it would come later on. And even then, I can't remember what I did, an hour ago, much less, when I was in my mother's womb or whatever. But yeah, their consciousness only comes after a certain stage, and even then you got to talk about, okay, what kind of properties or physical attributes do I need to even retain or hold memories, and that's a whole different subject. And when you get people like me who have mental disorders like ADHD, which for that, ironically, I can't remember what it is. I think it's a working memory. That I can't register things like the average person can. So I tend to not be able to recall things as easy, and I forget things really quick, which sucks.
Yeah, what a world. Well, Eric, that's about all the time we have today. So you have anything else you want to say before we start to wrap things up here?
Yeah, no, just keep me in your prayers. I haven't been on YouTube too much for a few reasons. One main reason is because I've been asked to write a book by Texas Baptists. Like I said earlier, I work with Texas Baptists, and we're looking to come out with some new material on evangelism. And initially, they had asked me to contribute to a book on evangelism, on sharing the gospel, but contribute an apologetics portion. But after talking about it, they said, well, why don't you just write your own book on just witnessing to non-believers? So I've been working on a book for witnessing to non-believers, and that's been taking like almost every single day for the past few months. So I've been really trying to hammer that out. Keep me in your prayers. I'm working on the final draft that I can work on to send in, but yeah, would definitely appreciate your prayers. But that's why I've been absent for the most part, is doing that. That's, like I said, taking pretty much every day for the past few months.
Yeah, it's super great, and we're looking forward to that. We'll definitely keep you in your prayers, Eric. So thank you so much for coming on and talking about substance dualism and all this fun stuff. So it's been a lot of fun, Eric, and thank you to everyone who tuned in. The Braxton, thank you, Jesus, Converse Contender, John Dunphy, the always amazing Nick Quint, and everyone else. Yeah, Eric, one last time, thank you so much for coming on, man. It's been a lot of fun today.
Hey, thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
And thank you everyone for tuning in, and God bless.